Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, a podcast where we discuss books about archaeology, but anyone can enjoy. I'm your host, Tristan Herenstein, and with me, as always, my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hey, everybody.
This time, we are moving on to the second section of Stealing History. This one kind of has everything you could possibly want from a crime drama, basically.
It does seem
It's got a little bit of everything.
crazy.
So this one's really a lot of fun. Not as negative as the last one, thankfully. It's got some hope to it as well.
Yes.
Plenty of dark, seedy stuff, though, too, of course.
Oh, yeah, a lot of intrigue.
Yeah. Before we jump into that, if you are listening to this as a podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating and a review. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like, subscribe, and comment. Tell us a little something about what you learned in the podcast or basically anything. It helps those algorithms, and it really helps us show our bosses that this is worth our time. So, starting off with Chapter 4, titled simply Backflap.
Which the title got me because I was so worried that it was just going to, you and I always tout archaeology is not about the thing. And then we're reading a book and the chapter is literally titled The Thing,
Right.
So I was a little concerned, but the author didn't let me down.
Nope, it's good. So if you recall, I think we discussed it a little bit last time, but a backflap is a piece of armor that was worn by the Moche culture up until the Spanish, I believe. And you can kind of picture it as if you think of like an axe head, where it's got the moon-shaped part. That is the part that hung over the backside of the warrior. And then the thinner part where the handle would go is actually where the cord was attached, and it would attach it to their waist.
And this one is more ceremonial than...
Right, because it was 2.5 pounds and it was made of gold, which is not a hard material.
Yeah, it wouldn't make great armor.
So it was a ceremonial thing. Just so you can kind of picture what this is, though. And you can look up pictures online. Like I said last time, I'm not often going to show pictures of the gold objects. I might make an exception here, but you can always find it online if you want to have a look at it yourself. We start with a description from Walter Alva, the archaeologist working on the Sipán site. They describe it as the largest, heaviest known Moche culture gold object. It must have been extremely impressive and probably famous object to these ancient people. However, this whole description was actually not the one that was stolen. This was actually the one that they recovered, and actually the smaller of the two.
Yeah.
And so most of this podcast, I guess, is kind of weave the story of this backflap throughout. There's other stuff too, but we get towards the end of the podcast, we kind of are still talking about it.
I feel like the backflap kind of becomes a character in this book in some ways. I know it's inanimate, but so much surrounds this one artifact as far as plot and intrigue. And even it almost reaches like mythological proportions, which is so silly to me. As an archaeologist, I'm like, really, guys?
Yeah, it's really, yes, it needs to go back to Peru. Yes, it needs to get out of circulation. But also to us, it's like, it's not that, like from an archaeological perspective, it's not the be all and end all.
Right. Yeah.
So if you recall last time, the Bernal brothers stole it from the tomb before anyone knew it existed and buried it under their chicken coop.
Super safe place for any artifact.
Right. Especially the largest one that they found, largest gold object. And so then they basically tried to sell it, but it was kind of a problem. It was too big and too recognizable, and too many people had seen it. It became an issue because once people see it, then it becomes identifiable as this was not, you have plenty of witnesses saying this person shouldn't own this.
Yeah. And I also found, and they talk about this a little bit later too with, I think, other artifacts, but the more hands artifact kind of passes through on the illicit market, the less valuable it becomes. Everybody wants the thing that's like fresh out of the ground and new. So like the longer something sits around and is looked at by people but not purchased by people, then people start to, its value, its perceived value depreciates.
Right. At one point, this backflap was broken into 2 pieces. The author seems to suggest someone is trying to make it look bigger by doing that. I'm not sure why he thinks that exactly. Probably just got beat up in back of someone's truck at some point.
That's what I was thinking. Or like I could see as people are trying to transport it or smuggle it somewhere that breaking it into might make it a little bit easier.
Yeah.
I could see maybe if it's broken into, you could fake, like trick somebody into thinking it's bigger than it is. I don't know. But yeah, I was a little bit confused as to why they came to that conclusion as well.
And I noticed too, he seemed to put a lot of weight on it being damaged, which, as we've talked about before, isn't that big of a deal to us, right?
Yeah, but I can see a
When you consider
collector.
its or when you consider its cultural symbolic relevance, yeah, I can get that, but just I noticed that.
Yeah. Oh, another thing I found interesting is, we talked last time about the registry that Peru had for artifacts. And this, I guess, was not part of anybody's official registry, the one that was looted.
Well, none of these objects were,
Right. Yeah.
but the problem that I understood was because so many people had seen it, you couldn't get it registered essentially.
Right.
Whereas the other things that were like no one had seen it before, you could say, "Oh yes, it's been in my family for
Right.
generations," right?
Yeah. And I thought, that whole registry is just super suspicious, like just
Yeah,
completely sus, because where do you think people are getting these things, even if it's been in your family for generations? If you're not Moche, and it's a burial good, and that type of artifact is known to be a burial good, then why is it not in a tomb like it should be? He says something too about how the government decides to enforce these laws kind of erratically when it comes to what's on the registry, what's not on the registry. We already talked about how Poli was able to take artifacts out of the country, which you shouldn't be able to do according to Peruvian law. There's something in there about as long as the site is not under active excavation, they could be registered. But as an archaeologist, I'm like, all sites at some point could potentially be excavated.
right.
So either way, you're ruining the context.
Yeah, it seems like the focus is more on keeping it in the country rather than getting the archaeological information.
Right. Yeah. Which, I mean, is valuable. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
But it doesn't go far enough to be of any use to like understanding past cultures in Peru. And I feel like the government kind of missed the point on that.
And so the Bernal brothers finally sold it in 1992 to a hotel owner who actually died just a few months afterwards, leaving it in the care of his brother, essentially.
And, it's funny because he talks in the book about how the guy dying actually kind of increases the mythology around the object.
It might be cursed now.
Yeah, now it might be cursed. So it's just so funny to me. And in my mind, when there's all this, like, I don't know what else to call it besides mythology, but all this like mythology and stuff around an object, and you're worried about it being cursed, it's because you're doing something wrong.
Yeah, yeah. It wasn't cursed until you picked it up.
Right.
Then he starts talking about how there was a point where collecting antiquities, within the country at least, was almost a gentleman's pastime.
Yeah, almost like let's go out for a picnic.
Yeah, and so he talks about the Arich family, if I'm saying that right, who at one point owned a huge amount of land and actually went out and systematically destroyed like 50 of these burial sites. And essentially, they says they had so many gold objects they didn't know what to do with them and just like gave them away as
Yeah, they would
gifts.
give them to family friends or friends of the family that like came to visit them, and they would get to pick their own object out of their collection to take back with them as kind of a token of their friendship. And wow. And
Yeah.
was this the family too where there were like kids running around and amongst the objects and they just like decorated their entire house with them?
No, that was a different family.
Okay. There's so many families.
Right. And so this family eventually lost everything in 1972 when military government took over country and basically redistributed a lot of wealth. That'll come into play later on with another personality, let's say, as well. So the back flap passed on to the hotel owner's brother, who basically just kept it hidden in like a liquor bottle plant he owned that went bankrupt.
Put it
just,
in a suitcase.
It was just kind of stashed.
Yeah. And the liquor bottling plant, he went bankrupt. So it was
Mhm.
just kind of an abandoned building, essentially.
There's like one person taking care of the whole place or something, yeah. There's a few cases where the author in this section that we're talking about, he talks about beliefs of the Moche culture in a certainty that kind of like I'm like a little suspicious of. And he does one here for the back flap. There's like some bells on it. He's the
the
Moche culture
tweezers.
believe the sound summoned supernatural forces.
I'm glad you picked up on that because I picked up on that too. And I do remember because I wrote a note about like, how do they know that?
Right.
But then later on in the book, it says that descendants of the Moche culture still use these same rattles in healing ceremonies. So I was like, okay.
Yep. So
But
thank you for giving me a little context. It
yeah,
was like the next page over though, and I was like, I had a whole page of what is he doing here?
I know I wrote like a paragraph
Yeah,
about how can you get that from just the object itself? There's only so much you can get
right.
from just the object.
And there may be justification for that, but if you're going to make a claim like that, I need a little bit of supporting evidence.
Right. Yeah, it seemed very certain and
That was a recurring issue we had with Four Lost Cities.
yes.
Was
Yes.
these claims made may or may not have had supporting evidence, but it wasn't provided in the book.
Right.
Or at least even hinted at, I guess. You don't need to go into like the whole analysis.
Right. You could just say studies show
Right.
or research has shown, but give us something
Right.
to let us know you're just not making this up out of thin air, which he did later on,
He
a couple
did.
pages after.
By and large, he's really good about it,
Yeah.
I will say. Another important set of items that came from these tombs are a set of what they call rattles. And so from the one that was excavated by Alva, there were 10 gold and 10 silver. And they say that gold represents sun and man, silver represents moon and woman. That seems to be a pretty common association across a lot of cultures, actually.
Yeah, I've heard that or something similar to that from various modern cultures as well as ancient cultures.
Right. And so Alva believes there were 10 of these looted from the other tomb. We don't know for sure. And so then we kind of go through a list of what happened to a bunch of them. 3 bought by this person, 1 by that person. I don't need to go through all of it, but essentially, I think eventually they can account for about 7 of them, if I remember right. And then we start getting into the smuggling operation, which is kind of fascinating in a way I, wished it wasn't happening, but it's still fascinating because the smugglers to start with were usually moving small objects. And so essentially they were just bribing airline crew to take things with them.
Right. Yeah. Airline crew, a couple government officials
Right.
or staff, things like that, people that were traveling back and forth, they would just say, hey, put
Take
this little thing
object, yeah.
with you, pack it in your suitcase and take it through for us. And they would. But yeah, like anything, as either the demand becomes more or the objects get bigger, you kind of have to resort to different tactics.
Right. So they started doing this with pots, larger amounts of them too. And so it's kind of amazing. Like they had whole like systems where they made fake bottoms and fake surfaces of these pots. And then when they got to their destination, you just pull those off.
Yeah, the slip that they would put on ceramics to make them look like tourist trinkets or something.
And they
then
put a
just
fake
wash
bottom
it off.
on and say made in Bolivia
Yeah.
or other place to kind of throw people off.
And they knew what ports and what airports and stuff they could use where they wouldn't be as scrutinized. And it, like, I know Bolivia was one where customs really kind of just shoved things through and then they would take it to Canada. And then from Canada, they would try and get it into the United States. It seems like, to me, I'm like, wow, this is a lot of effort, which
Yeah.
makes you think about how much money these people were probably making.
Yeah. And so this system is being done by 2 individuals called Fred Drew and David Swetnam. They're basically the distributors, essentially. So they're the middle people.
Yeah.
The smugglers. And so they started doing the false bottoms and everything, and they got 2 shipments in that way, but then they got caught in Vancouver, which seemed like they got off the hook, but it kind of spooked them, and so they had to find a different method.
Right.
And so then they start looking for a way of moving things through London instead of Vancouver to get to the U.S., and works with Michael Kelly. And so Kelly was kind of a dabbler in this stuff and the collecting and everything, but he wasn't doing that well financially. He had worked in the National Museum of Anthropology, Mexico City, and as I added my own comment, naturally, the British Museum.
Right. Burn.
Yeah. And so basically they used him. They set it up so when his father was ill, they paid for his ticket so long as he smuggled these things back for them.
And what got me is it gave the objects a European provenience, which was beneficial because if they come from South America, it's more suspicious.
Right.
And South or Central America. So they actually created this fake provenience and then attached his father's actual death certificate to make it seem like they came from his father's collection and he had inherited them. And I was just like that's just so gross.
It's very gross.
Like it's so wrong on so many levels. And Kelly, obviously he was put in a tough position because he was struggling financially. He's not completely innocent.
Definitely not.
But he was definitely being used.
Yeah. They even did stuff like wrap them in British newspaper.
I know.
Like they were thinking of little details here.
Yeah.
And so they first do this in 86 and another shipment like this in 87. And they label it personal effects, so it's duty free, which only gets them in trouble if they get caught. But I guess if they get caught, they've got bigger problems, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so when Sipán happened in 87, like they were like perfect position
Right.
basically. to
They've
take
already
advantage.
figured out all the details and the logistics. They were
Right.
ready to jump in.
So they bring in a shipment of Sipán atoms, and Michael Kelly brings it for them, as per usual. Unfortunately for them, they didn't tell him what was involved. He thought it was just more pots. And the idiots even unpacked all of these gold objects in front of him, and they just gave him the usual amount, essentially.
Yeah.
So he feels extra used. That comes into play in the next chapter.
Yes.
But it's like, you can kind of see where this is going. This is the same thing that happened with the Bernal guys.
Yep.
Someone feels like they're getting shafted, send it right to the police, essentially. So that's it for chapter 4. And now we move into chapter 5, titled Gold Man. And so, as you might expect, Michael Kelly betrayed the others. Surprise!
No honor among thieves.
No, definitely not. And so essentially, he felt humiliated and used. And so he made a deal with,
U.S. Customs.
to go undercover and serve as a mole. And for quite some time, he was basically ratting on them. And this resulted in some pretty huge raids.
Yeah. I think like over 1,000 artifacts were recovered in one of the raids.
Yep. Homes of Swetnam and Ben Johnson.
Who was the purchaser, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
And this was, at the time, the largest raid so far. Almost 1,400 objects
Yeah,
were
okay.
taken
Yeah.
from these two and then a whole bunch of other people as well.
And yeah, some of the other people were collectors who were like Nobel Prize winning physicists and authors and like all these very prominent people.
Well, and people who had pieces on display in museums.
I know.
You know?
That's another thing, and we can get into that a little bit more as we go through, but just the fact that so many museums have these looted collections on display is infuriating.
It really is.
And they're, in some ways, they're feeding the problem.
They're legitimizing it at the very least.
Yeah. Like if these people didn't have any way to display them and everything, maybe there would be less inclination to loot. I mean, I know it wouldn't be much less inclination, but the museums do not need to help the situation.
And what
be
do
worse.
the objects really bring them?
Right.
There's nothing they can really say about them.
Right.
Like, here's pretty stuff, which is what they were doing exactly.
When I notice a lot of them are like museums of art.
Yeah.
And I don't know much about like art interpretation and display as far as museums go, but I know as far as archaeology, the context again. And I know we keep harping on that because it's important.
Right. And so this big bust happens. Unfortunately, the prosecutors decide that the case was too weak because too much relied on Michael Kelly's testimony, and only Swetnam and Swetnam's wife was prosecuted, basically.
And he says Ben Johnson, he had struggled. He was a purchaser. He had diabetes since he was a kid, and he was in a wheelchair. It said that the prosecutors were afraid that the jury would take pity on him for his infirm state. And I was like, really? Like,
well, and the lawyers are the collectors, but also, and this blew my mind, the antiquities lobby. Like, you might as well have a meth lobby.
right?
That's insane.
Yeah.
So there is a lobby for people having the option of stealing other people's things.
Well, I mean, we've kind of seen that here in Florida on the legislative level. Collectors coming to the legislature trying to get laws enacted that would allow them to collect artifacts on state property and things.
Yeah, I don't know. When I hear lobby, I picture like people who are professional lobbyists being hired to do that. Whereas what we were seeing was mostly just like relatively average folks wanting to do this.
Yeah. But I do but I did find it like hilarious and sad and angering that I think it was Swetnam, like he only went to jail for like 6 months or prison, and for 6 months, he only served 4 months. So I guess he was sentenced to 6 months, served 4 months. He was allowed to keep all but 8 of his 360 artifacts that were seized, and he paid his lawyer with a freaking artifact.
From Sipán.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awful.
Yeah.
All other seized objects were returned to their owners.
Yeah.
Just broke my heart. So Peru is understandably unsatisfied with this outcome. And so they file civil lawsuits against Johnson, the Swetnams, and 4 others. Essentially, they wanted the pieces back. It seems like Peru's lawyers were not doing so great.
Yeah, they didn't prepare their witnesses adequately. And I think this was all based on the fact that the government of Peru is claiming, as per like a 1929 law, that it designated the state as owner of all archaeological resources, which I was like, really, Peru? You really are selective about when you enforce laws there, guys.
Right.
Considering the inconsistencies of their enforcement, that's not really...
That didn't help.
Yeah.
Well, and the defense lawyer's claims was that there was no record of Peru owning them. The author has to point out that there could not have been a record because they didn't know it existed. It was stolen before they knew it existed, which the lawyers entirely just didn't make that point at all.
And yeah, and I would feel like the fact that there's a law designating the state, and obviously you'd have to read into the law, but if there's a law saying that all artifacts or archaeological objects are property of the state, then why do you need a piece of paper for an individual artifact that has already been determined to come from Peru?
Well, and nobody asked the Bernal brothers to testify.
Right, I
which,
know.
You know, this author said he showed them photos when he was researching for this, and they recognized pieces.
Yeah.
It didn't go well.
No.
And so they ended up losing. However, the ongoing effect of this is it highlighted what a big problem all of this is.
Right.
People were now aware of it, and it put into disrepute a lot of the people who were involved in it. They were no longer high class. It kind of hurt their reputation pretty significantly, it seems.
Which isn't near enough, but at least it's something.
It's not satisfying, but it was a start, essentially. Yeah. And we'll kind of go on from there. One thing I thought was interesting was the authors talk about how they apply a false provenience to these things to be able to sell them. And it occurred to me that people are then buying them under these false proveniences.
Yeah.
Which they think they value the object for its history, but that history is a lie.
That's true. Yeah.
And they probably know it too.
I would imagine.
Right?
I mean, if they really genuinely cared, I feel like they wouldn't own that property. You know what I'm saying?
It's a recurring thing in this section too. It's like the truth behind the face they put forward is really obvious.
Because, I've had people come up to me and, oh, you're an archaeologist. I bet you have a really cool collection. And it's like, no, I do not have a collection of my personal artifacts because I understand their significance. So I think anybody who has a personal collection of artifacts isn't being genuine as far as wanting to protect them.
Which actually will come up with an archaeologist museum curator later on in this.
Right, yeah.
Actually.
Yeah. But so they talk briefly, Johnson ends up passing away relatively young. I think he was in his 50s.
About 3 years after Sipán was found in 87. So.
Yeah, so all of his artifacts were sold to Sotheby's auction house. And Sotheby's listed the provenience as Ben Johnson's collection.
Right.
And this is infuriating because I'm like, how? Because we talked a little bit about how we are mad that the museums are displaying these objects. But then Sotheby's, who is probably one of the most well-known auction houses in our country, if not the world, they're selling these objects with let's face it, a pretty weak provenience.
Well, I mean, not that I like it still, but at least they're in it for the money. It's a part of what they're set up to do.
That's true. They're not at least...
Museums don't have an excuse.
Right, yeah. But I feel like they're also contributing to the problem because how is this any different than selling... I mean, you wouldn't be able to say somebody broke into a jewelry store and stole a bunch of jewelry and then they pass away and the jewelry gets sold to Sotheby's and they find out it's stolen. Would they then sell it? Auction it off?
They could get away with it, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's no different.
Right. Well, and as quoted from the book here, as with most looted antiquities, no one could say exactly where the pieces in his collection came from.
Right.
Because that's why they didn't have any provenience with them. They didn't know.
Yeah.
Lost forever.
Yep.
And so the trials didn't work for Peru, and Peru decided their best way forward was through diplomatic means. And so a little bit of background here. The U.S. government essentially had a deal with Peru where they would give a lot of aid, and half of that aid would be economic, so long as Peru allowed the other half to be military. And essentially the point here was to try and fight the cartels and the cocaine business. It wasn't a great deal for them, it doesn't seem. It seemed like the U.S. kind of pushing people
It
around,
was
which,
the whole war on drugs
yeah.
era.
But at the very least, it gave Peru some leverage.
Right.
And so essentially what they were able to do was capitalize on the American government's way of capitalizing on the antiquities trade, essentially. And I'm not sure I quite follow the author's point here, but essentially the idea, as I understood it, was the antiquities trade was stealing from other countries, and that made those countries unhappy. And so it was in the U.S. government's best interest to keep those countries happy. Then they would take steps to fight the antiquities trade from those countries.
Right.
And so now it was in the U.S.'s interest to keep the Peruvian government happy. And this gave them enough leverage to kind of push this forward. Now, the author kind of implies that the U.S. government saw it as a dangerous market and a useful tool. And it felt to me like he didn't say it, but it felt to me like that almost didn't apply unless they were actively encouraging the antiquities market so they could use it to show, look, we're doing this thing for you. And there was no indication in the book that that's what was going on. To me, it was more like, we want this country to be happy with us. We need to make this kind of go away.
Yeah.
To make them happy with us.
Yeah.
That's kind of what it felt like, unless I wouldn't put it past people to do that, but that one didn't pick up that detail from this book, at least.
To me, it was just like good old fashioned politicking, right?
Yep.
So just bargaining with another country, and you want this, we want this kind of thing. So let's make a deal.
And so Peru applied to essentially have the Sipán artifacts protected. And what this gave the U.S. Customs the power to do is seize any artifacts that they suspected might be from that area.
Right.
And it put burden of proof on the person doing the importing to show that it was not.
Right.
My interpretation of this goes is it's probably not only stopping Sipán artifacts, but it's also stopping other things that they probably wouldn't give much look at. But now they look at it and they say, oh, wait, this wasn't supposed to be out here either.
Right.
And so I think this is actually a pretty big deal. And we'll see that it ends up being that eventually. I think it's a pretty big win.
I mean, it was such a mess and everything was being handled so poorly. Anything at this point would be a win.
Right. Well, yeah, that's true. Any win here is a pretty big win because, like we talked about last episode, it was just depressing all the way through.
Oh my
pretty
gosh,
much.
it was so hard.
So in 1990, this is kind of an aside, but it's relevant to the overall discussion. There's a museum in Chile that opened an exhibit on the Moche culture titled Moche, the Lords of Death. Goodness gracious, that's a terrible, terrible title.
I know. Right. But I mean, it makes sense too if you look at what had been excavated and what had been focused on. It's all the tombs, right? And it's
sacrifices.
Yes,
they were all about the sacrifices and the bloodiness and the drama.
Yeah, and it fits, right? It's that whole intrigue and
I get it.
Yeah,
I hate it.
Morbid curiosity.
Yeah, and so Walter Alva actually helped out this exhibit by sending some photos. What he didn't know at the time was that this exhibit was also accepting 3 of the looted items to be on display, which again is sending these items out of the country. And there's no comment about if there was any stink made about that.
Well, and this was the one too with some of the artifacts were from Carlos Cardoin. Is that how you would say it? The arms dealer?
Yes.
Who was a known arms dealer to some of the world's worst dictators, including Saddam Hussein.
Yes. Actually, was indicted in 1992 for exporting materials for making cluster bombs, to give you kind of an idea of who we're dealing with. One of the objects, and it's such a fascinating object, I'm going to kind of do the description of it here, because again, it's not, for us, it's not about this was a gold shiny thing. It's in the craftsmanship that is mind-boggling.
Right.
So one of the objects was a deer's head, labeled as a dog's head because it hadn't been, archaeologists hadn't studied it. But essentially, it had its mouth open, and inside was the tongue of the deer, and it was actually suspended on wires so that it actually would move.
Yeah. To me, that is so cool.
This is a 1,500-year-old object, and they had the craftsmanship to design that. It's just
and it lasted. It survived.
Yeah. It survived. It survived archaeologists. It did not survive the looters,
right?
Because we don't know if this particular head had that. What we do know is that there was another one found by the archaeologist that had that set up.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, I forgot that detail, but that's important. So the looting in the U.S. had tapered off for a while, and then it came back strong, of course.
as a result of all of this, things started getting held up in customs pretty regularly. In 1993, U.S. Customs at Dallas Fort Worth Airport found a crate from Italy, and it was holding artifacts from Peru and Mexico that they believed to be from Peru and Mexico. And they had brought in an archaeologist named David Wilson to come in and essentially authenticate the artifact so they could figure out where they came from, send them back if they need to, supposedly, and do whatever needed to be done. Well, he looked at them and said, yes, indeed, they are Peruvian and Mexican. And then he just kind of, I guess that was it, right? He left. They were obviously given back to the dealer because he saw them in a U.S. art gallery.
Yeah.
So even though he was brought in to deal with this, nothing happened.
He said they are Moche culture, but apparently the customs agents were only concerned if they were from Sipán, which is a protected area.
Right.
So there's kind of limitations of Peru's victory there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so very unfortunate. Also, at this time, Peru was watching auction houses, and
oh, yes.
they spotted some in, what was the auction house again?
Sotheby's.
Sotheby's, once again. And so essentially, to get Sotheby's to pull this down, they had to contact the U.S. Attorney General to make them. And then the auction house voluntarily gave up 2 necklaces, but sold the other pieces.
Right.
Voluntarily.
Yeah, which they shouldn't have had them in the first place.
And they shouldn't have been allowed to sell the rest, frankly.
Yes.
But the necklaces were definitely from Sipán. That was kind of what happened. The rest of the pieces probably shouldn't have been sold either, but I think they were not necessarily identified. And then we move into the biggest and strangest bust, according to the author, which essentially they find a crate full of what is labeled as Peruvian handcrafts, and inside is all kinds of pots, weavings, and human bones.
Well, and this is the one where this was in Miami International Airport, so that in and of itself kind of adds the intrigue, right? Because that was a big cocaine smuggling
That's
area.
why I got checked in the first place.
Yeah, because they were like, wow, this is a really large crate, but the value for whatever in the crate seems suspiciously low. We better look at this. And yeah, it was around the time when, there was the big war on drugs and we were going to bust cocaine dealers and the cartels and everything. So that actually helped in some cases because at the time, law enforcement had a lot of leeway in how they could deal with this stuff because there was the war on drugs happening at that time. So it kind of, in some ways, worked in archaeologists' favor.
Advantage, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, not favor necessarily, because still not the best solution.
Right.
And so in the bottom of this crate, also, they found 10 Sipán items, including one of the presumably 10 missing rattles.
Yes. There were also human remains in the crate, too.
Lots of human remains because people buy those stuff.
Yeah, which
I hate it.
Creepy.
It's awful. And so this is then passed on to a young lawyer named Maria Capo, who basically no one else wanted the case, and she just kind of went ham.
Yeah.
Like, wow, this person's a hero.
Yeah, well, it was funny, too, because she was kind of handed it because she was the low person on the totem pole as far as getting cases, right? And nobody else really wanted it.
Mm-hmm.
But she went for it.
Yeah. And so this was going to go to Switzerland to be laundered, essentially. And it was supposed to be handed off to a company called Transrover, who she couldn't get a hold of until their lawyer finally contacted them. And eventually the lawyer stopped talking to her. The lawyer then calls her again later and says he's not working for them anymore. And they find out that basically Transrover never existed.
Yeah, it was just kind of like it
was created just to move these objects.
Yeah.
And when they felt like they were made, they just dissolved it and vanished like cockroaches.
I mean, there's a lot of similarities between how these smugglers were bringing in artifacts as how the cartels were bringing in drugs at the time.
Yeah, there's a number of comparisons made throughout this, for sure. And so Maria Capo ends up doing a lot of dancing to try and get this resolved, essentially. She's dead set on sending these back, which, major props.
Yeah.
And eventually she does win and gets these all sent back to Peru.
She was determined.
Yeah.
I like her.
Yeah. It's quite a story. She had to be such a huge headache to deal with all this because she couldn't talk to people. They couldn't talk to them. Then the receiver is gone and she's like, well, then they go back. And then her boss is like, no, or the judge who was a collector.
Yes.
Is like, no, you need to try to find the person who owns these.
Yeah, the judge in this case about looting was an artifact collector. Like, how is that not a conflict of
No
interest?
kidding. Ugh. And so, but eventually this one does end up going back. This is kind of representing a change in the environment, that the US Customs are on top of this, at least relatively, and they are willing to stick their neck out to fight these things.
Finally.
Yes. So officially, nobody knows who those artifacts belong to or who was involved with them. Practically, apparently everyone pretty well knows. It was a person named, do you know how to say his last name? I'll just say Raul. It's his first name because I'm not sure I want to try his last name. But Raul, who was a collector and a distributor in Peru, kind of weirdly, apparently he and Walter Alva, the archaeologist, were friends. And I have trouble processing that.
Yeah, that is weird to me.
Unless it's just like he comments on the whole dance archaeologists have to do here to kind of
That
access these things a bit.
that's what I was thinking too,
But he
is like
describes them
at
as
least
friends, and that's kind of, I'm not sure I quite buy that, honestly.
I wonder too, like, okay, so this is the journalist writing it. It's not Alva writing it. I would wonder if he went to Alva and said, "Are you friends with Raul?" How he would explain that friendship
Right.
and justify it. And I'm betting it has something to do with, like, possibly, I hope, it has something to do with kind of fostering a relationship with him for access to the collection.
And so Raul, after the Miami bust, became really reclusive and just kind of hid in his apartment for a long time. And so then shifting directions a little bit, Peru's economy at the time was booming for a few, and Louis, who had inherited the back flap from his brother, still had it, and he wasn't doing so well. So his brother had suggested he try to arrange a trade with the back flap with one of their debtors, essentially to forgive the debt. And they had a buyer set up by the name of Dennis Garcia, who is actually going to be really important for the rest
Right.
of this podcast,
Yeah.
at least.
Yeah.
And that made the whole deal more appealing to the person they were trying to forgive the debt with. So that basically got set up, and Garcia is quite a personality as well.
Yeah, I think he was friends with the couple that owned all that land that was taken by the government, where they would just kind of,
The Arich family.
yeah, they would go and collect artifacts together. They would kind of dig up tombs for the fun of it, kind of like, hey, like I said earlier, like, let's go picnicking or let's go fishing.
Yeah.
Yeah. To be clear, this was in the 60s. So before, even though looting existed and has always been a problem, it wasn't really recognized as such at that time. And I also found it funny that one of their digging partners was Alva's predecessor. So like, Alva, again, is the archaeologist. So his predecessor was apparently somebody who would hang out with these people and possibly loot tombs with them.
Yeah. And he basically enjoyed that gentleman's pursuit idea.
Gentleman's pursuit. That's a perfect way to
benefited from by working his way into that, essentially.
Yeah.
He didn't start off rich, but he benefited from rubbing elbows with those individuals. And then it kind of fell apart, like we said, in the 70s.
Right.
And he fell out of love with Peru and moved to Miami.
Well, and I think he was originally from Cuba. And so when he was in Peru, so he's familiar with the Cuban Revolution. And I think part of it was he saw a little bit of that happening at that time in Peru, and he wanted to get out of there.
Yep.
So the politics kind of led him to fall out of love with Peru.
Well, and he lost all his buddies, weren't as rich anymore.
Right.
You know,
he couldn't go looting.
Couldn't go looting. He couldn't live the high life.
Yeah.
Like he could before. So he moves back to Miami. And so around 94, he learns about the back flap. At this point, the antiquities market had changed quite a bit. It wasn't, like I said, there wasn't a gentleman's pursuit anymore. It was kind of a dirty, seedy, risky legally, risky in other ways, as we'll find out.
Yeah.
Bribes were more expensive. U.S. Customs were more active. And it, like you said, it shared a lot of things with the drug trade. And so Garcia was kind of connected with a distributor / aka smuggler in Miami and had his contacts in Peru. And then they had a potential buyer in the U.S. named Robert Bazin, another name to remember here.
Yes.
And so fill in if I missed anything, because I didn't think this was important as it was when it was brought up in the story. I didn't take as many notes in a couple cases. Had to go back and fill some things in. They all meet to do a get acquainted deal, essentially prove that you are not, law enforcement or something, and buy this thing from us. And so they sell him a necklace. And a part of this meeting, Bazin comes with his Spanish-speaking associate, And Garcia has a letter written in Spanish and English, and Bazin and his associate read the letters out loud.
Yes, both the English letter and the Spanish letter. And as soon as I was reading that, I was like, oh, that's shady. He wants to make sure that's, I was like, somebody, I don't, yeah. I was like, oh, this is shady. This is shady. Bazin isn't who he thinks he is.
I didn't pick up on it right away.
Oh, I did right away. I was like, oh, this is amazing. How did he not think that was weird, or like be like, huh, this is suspicious?
Well, apparently they did think it was weird, but didn't think much more of it.
Right. But I would have been like, stop, hard stop, immediately. We're done.
Pack it up, we're out. Yeah.
Yep.
Good thing we're not criminals. We'd be too good at it, apparently.
I don't know. I think I might be better at it than Dennis Garcia.
Maybe.
But I did think it was interesting too how like they kind of courted dealers or seller or buyers, I guess. Let's sell him a small thing, see how it goes. Let's sell him a little something bigger, see how it goes, you know? And all this to kind of just try and gear up towards getting rid of the back flap.
Well, and they wanted to get it, but they didn't have a plan to get it there. Didn't know when it would happen.
What a gamble.
And so they try to sell him all this other stuff, and they're all like junk and fakes and things until finally Bazin like gets fed up with them and tells them to stop jerking him around.
Yeah. Well, Bazin, he didn't hear from him for about 3 years at one point. And Bazin, I guess he said that he couldn't meet with them because he had a heart
surgery.
Surgery. That's what it was. Heart surgery coming up. And he would introduce him to his associates who would kind of handle the situation. And guess what? They're all FBI. You know, that's why I was like, when they were reading the letters out loud, I was like, oh, somebody's mic'd.
Well, and the names are amazing. So it's handed off to someone Bazin knows in the FBI named Bob Whitman. And Whitman is buying for the Gold Man,
Hombre de Oro,
who just loves gold. And it turns out the Gold Man is actually U.S. District Attorney Robert Goldman. Which is amazing.
It was like perfect. How and I could just see how like they came up with that. They're like, oh, this is great.
Practically a James Bond movie.
I know.
It's so good.
But yeah, so they were walking right into an FBI sting operation.
Yeah, that is so good.
But yeah, that was the end of the chapter.
That
and
was
we were
it.
Like, oh.
Yeah.
But yeah, as I was reading this, I was just like, this is real. Like sometimes I would start reading it and I'm like, oh, this is a great kind of work of fiction. And then I'm like, no, this is real.
This is real, yes. Oh, shoot. All right. So moving on to chapter 6, The Lord of Sipán. Before we get on to FBI stings and more smuggling, we're going to talk more about archaeology, which, as much as I like those things, this is pretty good stuff too.
Yeah.
So looking back at Walter's excavations, talking about how they were connected to the elite people. I like that because I was kind of concerned about that last episode. I really like this author. Like, boy, he's good. This quote, which I felt was such a very concise way of helping us understand the Moche culture on their own terms. The blood-soaked rituals of sacrifice and cannibalism in which the Moche rulers appeased the elements, courted immortality, and made sense of a random and violent universe. What a good way of putting that. Like, it's not nice to us, but it isn't malicious.
Right. There was a reason.
It's an adaptation, kind of.
Yeah.
To trying to make sense of the world.
Right.
It's not our way, and it's a little horrifying to us, but it's still a cultural adaptation to that.
Right.
So I thought that was really well done.
No, I thought the whole like first part of this chapter where he discusses the human sacrifices and the cannibalism and things like that were really well done. And I think it was really important.
Yeah.
I'm really glad he decided to include that because so often people get wrapped up in the ooh and ah and
the drama and the horror and the gore and
and they forget that these were people experiencing their world, their universe on their terms. And they had reasons for these things. And it wasn't just the gore, right?
And so the excavations were revealing kind of connections between the military and the religion of the Moche culture. It was telling us a lot about how this culture operated, or at least viewed themselves in the world. And so they had actually found in the 70s some depictions on ceramics of the sacrifice ceremony. But because it was so piecemeal, I think the assumption was that it was basically a myth.
Right. A
It wasn't a
story.
real thing that happened.
Yeah. And this is why even something that an archaeologist finds, it may not make sense at the time, but later on, as you learn more and gather more data and find more artifacts within their context,
Right.
that even the most insignificant object can really help tell the story. And that's kind of what happened here. So I think he did a really good job explaining how
Yeah.
that happened.
Yes, a lot of the focus is still on the gold, but there's a lot of non-gold objects talked about in this one particular.
Yeah.
So this was interesting, and this is a bit more where I kind of felt this was getting a little speculative. Again, it could have merit, but it wasn't seeing it in the book.
Right.
So we had what they refer to as the young musician soldier, which on a labeling purpose, yeah, we do that kind of thing. We call this burial musician soldier because they found pen pipes and soldiers' tools. The idea that he was a musician soldier isn't necessarily something you want to assume, I don't
Right.
think.
Yeah.
Right? And I feel like that's what happened here. But one of the things found with him, and I thought this was cool, was, quote, unusual spear throwing device, end quote. And I love this because I'm like, is that an atlatl?
I actually have atlatl question mark
Me
in
too.
my notes.
And so for people listening at home, an atlatl, spelled ATL, is a spear throwing device that predated the bow and arrow and was used after the bow and arrow still. Essentially, a good way of thinking of it is if you think of those tennis ball throwers for your dog with basically an arm extension, it's the same thing, only instead of a tennis ball in the end, you have a spear dart, and that it gives you a heck of a lot of range on throwing these things.
Yeah.
And then I looked into it a bit more, and it turned out this atlatl, they associated it with a ancient game. And essentially, there's a great video of people playing this or recreating it based off of the depictions on pots and things. And if I remember, I'll link it. If I don't, someone remind me. But what happened was essentially you have basically a badminton shuttlecock, so feathers in a bundle, on a string wrapped around an atlatl dart. And this person throws the atlatl dart, and while it's in the air, unwinds, and the feathers start to float down. And then all the competitors have their own atlatl darts with wooden X's on the shafts, and they throw it and they try and catch the feathers with their dart.
Oh my gosh.
And in the recreation, people are replaying this game for the first time in 100 years or whatever. They're actually catching it.
Really?
They were good atlatl users. Obviously, they knew what they were
Wow.
doing. But it was a lot of fun. Very fascinating idea. I want to play it now. Barbara,
Experimental archaeology.
festival competition. That won't end in someone getting jabbed with an atlatl dart. Yeah, and so Alva's cited here as referencing this soldier musician as the Lord's favorite musician sacrificed to entertain him after death. And that's when I was like, that's...
Very speculative.
It
I mean, there
feels
could be more to it, but
it's coming from an archaeologist, so there might be more behind it.
right.
But from what I have, it's like, yeah.
Yeah, I would need to know what
Another
basis
one
there is
that
for
kind
that.
of flagged for me was a man was found with his feet amputated and metal discs to prevent him from running away from his job. And again, it's like, where
Right.
does that come from?
Yeah,
right?
there were a couple of things within this chapter where I was like, okay,
Relatively minor, and it doesn't seem to be the norm. So I'm going to, let it go. But I feel like I have to kind of point some of these out as we come to them.
there might be a reason for that, and
Right.
it's just not in the book. And again, you and I are reading this as an archaeologist, but he may not have wanted to get bogged down in
This
all those
book
details.
isn't written for us.
Yeah, exactly.
But by the end, he had recovered the remains of 35 people and thousands of objects. But he had a problem because the museum he ran was too small to host even a small fraction of this. And if he did, it'd just be a bunch of stuff for people to look at.
Right. And I love this discussion so much.
Yeah. As a good interpreter, he's like, no, this needs to have context. People understand what's going on here. As part of a 10-year effort, he got basically money and funding and everything for a new museum.
I thought it was interesting because this discussion about curation issues, that comes with archaeology, right? You and I have gotten calls where they're like, hey, we need to come out and excavate a shipwreck. And it's like, okay, where are we going to store the stuff that we find from that shipwreck, right? Sometimes things are better off left in place if they're stabilized and left alone.
And looters are going to not get them.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, that's obviously not the case with
Right.
Sipán, but it's an issue that every that archaeology in general faces. And I like that he was able to touch on it and then touch on not wanting museums to be what you and I often call cabinets of curiosity, right?
Mhm.
Just things that people can ooh and ah over, but have no context. They have no educational value. I thought it was interesting because, we've touched on this traveling exhibit that has kind of gone around. And I don't necessarily know if this exhibit that he talks about here is a way to raise money for the permanent museum is the same exhibit that he talked about earlier in the book when things were kind of circulating. But he used a traveling exhibit as a way to raise money for this museum, which I thought was an interesting way to go about it. So, like, the money people paid to come see the exhibit helped fund a permanent
And I
museum.
think he was finding people to donate money for the museum along the route as
Yeah,
well.
for sure.
I
It
just
was a
think
it
it's
was
the
a
idea.
publicity kind of funding.
Pretty smart,
Yeah,
honestly.
but I thought it was funny too. I had to laugh because at one point while it was in the States, he gave Kissinger a personal tour.
Mhm.
And up until the end, he didn't realize that Alva was the actual archaeologist who excavated the site. And I felt that because I think we've all had those moments where talking about a site or talking about something and they're like, oh yeah, something, something, something. And then somehow you mention that you're the one who excavated it or you're the one who wrote that article or you're the one who specializes in that. And they just look at you like, oh, you?
Or kind of a same line is like, "So how long have you been a student for?"
Oh my gosh. Yes. Yes.
Like, "I do this for a job."
Yes. Yes. We are professionals. And I get that a lot too. I look younger than I am. So I'm
I noticed
apparently,
we haven't gotten it like we used to.
oh, we must be getting older,
It
Tristan.
must be. Darn.
I'm honestly okay with that.
Yeah. So it travels through the US on a 2-year show. Ends up in the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, which I didn't care for. There's a tendency to put ancient cultures on display, especially like Native American cultures in the US, on display in museums of natural history, which kind of has implications that they're viewed as part of the landscape to be exploited.
Yes.
And there's been a definite trend to stop doing that, and this was in 93.
Yeah, and a lot of museums have actually changed their name or kind of divided up their collections and created
Yep.
multiple museums. Museums are starting to recognize that as an issue finally.
Yep. And in 93, I think this was maybe a new issue being raised
think
about
so,
then.
yeah.
So, okay, it doesn't hurt to see it, basically.
Right.
Not necessarily faulting anyone. And after the US tour, it went to Germany and then Japan. He was not wild about going to Japan, apparently. He didn't think it would serve the funding purpose, and I guess it didn't, but
Yeah. When I was reading that, I was like, "Oh, wow, cool. It went all the way to
yeah,
Japan,"
yeah.
Like that would cuz that has to be such a different culture for them to experience and for
And the way it was presented to
yeah.
Western cultures, I hadn't thought about that, yeah.
Yeah, just how would you I would like to know if they had to change anything about the exhibit as it moved through the different countries to make it more appealing, to make it more palatable for different cultures.
Yeah.
Because, people are going to perceive things about that differently.
In 93, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what happened now.
Yeah,
Right.
probably not. But
But it'd be cool if they did and to hear how they changed it.
well, and especially if like the whole purpose of this exhibit was essentially as a fundraising tour,
Right.
like you would think you would want to do everything you could within your power to make it as fascinating as possible to people so that they would want to donate money. But I don't know that that was done. And even if they did, if that would be successful.
Okay. So, yeah, Sipán became very famous. At the time, it was on the lines of the Egyptian discoveries and
Yeah.
everything as well. And then we move on to a collector slash distributor, I guess, named Aldo Valdera, living in San Isidro, which I think is like a district in Lima, Peru, essentially. And so he actually showed the author his collection and was proud of it and had just like stuff like an Inca funerary wrap hanging on his living room wall and had a huge pot he said he kept in this one particular place because otherwise the kids would smash it. And they've smashed about 50. Ha ha.
I know.
And I was like, yeah, you guys care about this stuff so much, right?
I know, like they're trying to save it from the archaeologists.
Right. They care about it. He also said he never bought from other collectors. So he only bought freshly looted grave goods, is my interpretation of
Yep.
that. And that just, again, kind of brings home the fact, and you kind of talk about this too, about how if it's come from someone else, they don't want it. Like, it's not, because it's not about the thing even. It's not, it's about ego.
Yeah,
That's what it is.
really.
There's no real pretending. This book does a really good job of kind of shedding that illusion.
Yep. Aldo talks a little bit about how he figures that about 90% of all Peruvian valuable artifacts existed outside of Peru. And this infuriated me. He said, and when that happens, or he said, eventually, like all of it'll be excavated and outside of Peru. And he's like, when that happens, all of my objects will be much more valuable.
Right. Because it's about saving history, right?
Yeah.
Right. Give me a break.
I was like, that's really kind of a disgusting and depressing way to think of it.
Yeah. So then we move on to taking a look at a Museo Archaeologico Rafael Larco Herrera. It's my best American pronunciation of that. And so this museum is kind of interesting, and I have mixed feelings about it a bit because it started as a collector's collection.
Right.
The guy doing it, Rafael Larco Hole, started in the 40s, and he was going around buying pieces from locals, doing some of his own digging, and he was trying to set up timelines for things.
And if you take it into the context, like I was at first like, oh, but then I was like, okay, 40s archaeology was a lot different then too.
He was actually pretty relevant to the times.
Yeah.
This is what we call culture history. If you look back at the beginning of Small Things Forgotten, we talk about this a bit, kind of the progress. And so he was doing culture history, which is all about collecting things to set up timelines. Not much concept that the little pieces, and there's more you can learn from this yet.
Right.
And he's right on the cusp of that, essentially. Yeah. He's perfectly fine, I think. And this kind of thing had to happen for us to kind of figure out.
Right. That's the thing.
Right?
Like it wasn't perfect, but it was a starting point.
And without that starting point, we wouldn't have gotten
Right.
where we are now.
Yeah. So when you're reading this section, just keep an open mind a little bit. And I did like how the author talks a little bit about like context and like obviously his chronology was not perfect, right? But like you said, it was a starting point. But there's a good discussion on basing essentially an entire cultural interpretation based on one object, one type of object. Like in this case, ceramics, it would be like us going into someone's kitchen and based on their kitchenware, interpreting their entire culture.
Right.
So, but you have to start somewhere, right?
Yeah. The author, I mean, he's not being unfair under the context of today.
Right.
I felt like he didn't have the full context of the history of the time when this person was working.
Yeah, he says like it would obscure as much as it would illuminate.
Right. If people were doing that today, every criticism he makes is perfectly valid.
Right.
For the person who was doing this at the time, I don't think it's
pretty
as valid.
on par with what was happening at the time, even within archaeology.
And so the director of this museum, he says there's very little left. Even less for the looters, essentially. So much has been destroyed. Then he goes on to criticize those who demonize collectors and argues that museums started with collections, which is true. A lot of them did.
Right.
And he supports legal collection. And so my thought was here, like, this sounds like one of those archaeologists that's stuck on the idea that it's about the things.
Right. And we know today there are archaeologists.
They're around.
There are. Yeah. Yeah. I had a lot of mixed emotions as I was reading this part.
I think there could be something because he is a director of a museum that got its start from a collector.
Right. And I think a lot of it might be maybe self-preservation.
His own bias, at least.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's definitely kind of a biased opinion, I would say.
Yeah.
But I think it's messy and you get these mixed emotions, but I think the author navigates it really well.
He does.
And I think that's archaeology. That's this whole issue. It's messy. It's not necessarily always cut and dry. There's always this little gray area that's going to exist. And how do you navigate that? And so I think it's important that the author touched on that.
Mm-hmm. And then we move into looking at how Sipán changed archaeology in Peru. And this is kind of some comments I had last time, basically. This is kind of building on that. So yeah, essentially, when Sipán was found, now it's all about the royal tombs and all about the gold.
Yeah.
Even for the archaeologists.
I mean, this is not just Sipán, excavating anywhere. He talks about how it changed just Peruvian archaeology overall.
Yeah, and for the good and the bad.
Right. Yes.
And so one reason it's all about the gold and the royal tombs for the archaeologists is because those are the ones being targeted, and you have to target them yourself to save them.
Right.
Although I think there's probably plenty of non-royal tombs being targeted as well, because people don't necessarily know what they're digging into.
Well, I mean, we've had Peruvian mummies put on display and, things like that are not necessarily elite. But so, yeah, there's targeting of anything that is interesting, different. But it's just sad because what I think is really bad about this is the funding of archaeological excavations. And, he touched on it earlier talking about ceramics. You can't base an entire culture on one thing. And when you're studying the elites and you're only funding archaeologists who are studying the elites, you're only learning about the elites.
Right.
And to me, one of the biggest strengths in archaeology is its ability to study the everyday happenings of everyday people.
And to quote the book here, now archaeologists look for gold. That was part of the whole change in attitude brought by Sipán. It was a catalyst. And this disturbed me almost as much as the looting did.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Me too. It was.
However, to put a bit of a positive spin on it, it wasn't all bad. Funding was there now. There wasn't any funding before. Right? They had no support. And the government was not interested in helping them. Private investors were not interested, but now they were.
And people within Peru, people like the village of Sipán, they saw archaeologists as the enemy. And when you are learning about even the people, even the elites, this leads to villagers of Sipán and others having a understanding and an appreciation for their own heritage and history and kind of, I don't want to use the word richness because then it sounds like I'm talking about just the gold, but I don't even know what the word would be. Depth of their culture, and I think with that comes a more willingness to protect the sites and maybe a better understanding of why they should be protected, hopefully.
And kind of in the defense of a lot of people who, at least on the local level, who don't like archaeologists too, when you say all archaeologists are looking out for is their own riches, and then archaeologists are targeting gold just as much as everyone else,
that's justified.
That's not entirely, well, it's not entirely justified, but it's easily understood why they would see it that way.
Yeah. So it's kind of a vicious circle, isn't it?
Yeah, some good and some bad in there. Not an ideal situation, though, by any means still. And then we move on to Chapter 7, our final chapter for this podcast episode, The Dealer. So after taking a break away from the FBI sting operation, we're back. So we're dealing with Raul again, who had ended his seclusion, as we talked about, and was out lending ancient Inca necklaces to people who should know better. Again,
yes.
And then he just got murdered in his apartment.
Yeah, so in my notes I said, wow, this chapter starts out with a bang. But it was interesting to me because he was hosting a dinner party. He had two apartments in the same building. He had his penthouse, and then he had another apartment, I guess, which would be below the penthouse. So he was hosting dinner in his regular apartment. Obviously, you can tell I don't own a penthouse.
Right.
But I believe penthouses are always on the top, right?
My understanding,
yeah. So, and then while his party guests were downstairs, he went up to his penthouse, I guess to meet somebody to make some deal or something, it sounds like.
He was always dealing on the side.
Yeah. Well, time passed and he didn't come back downstairs. And I believe they called his penthouse apartment and nobody answered. So they went to go investigate and found out that he had been shot.
Yep. And things were smashed and stolen.
Yeah, there was obviously foul play.
And so exactly what happened here is uncertain because the police basically told the family to not push it because someone powerful was involved.
Yeah, they told him, just don't even pursue investigation. Yeah. And the police, while they were up there, didn't really do anything. I don't think they took any fingerprints or did anything that you would expect police. They didn't do basic police work, what I would understand to be basic police work.
And so exactly what happened, we don't know.
Right.
There's a bunch of rumors about, it could be about the Miami bust. It could have been about another bus or another deal that went wrong. He sold a bunch of things to smugglers and they got it all the way to where its destination, found out it was fake and he didn't want to give the money back. Who knows exactly?
But this brought to light just how dangerous this kind of path could be.
Well, and how tragic it was for his kids.
Yeah. Oh,
They had no idea he was doing this stuff.
that blew my mind. Yeah. So they had no idea. And they didn't find out until after he had been murdered,
Yeah.
just what he was into. And I guess especially his son felt very betrayed by him. And that's just
Left out of his life and
yeah, like you didn't
Oof.
know who your father was,
Yeah.
essentially. You know,
Yeah, so not nice.
yeah, it just was very, very sad.
It's kind of like the Brunel's father.
You
Like
know,
people on the edges are the ones that get hurt the most, it seems like.
and there
sometimes.
seems that's definitely a trend, and nobody comes out of this, like, of smuggling and tomb raiding, like nobody wins in
Right.
the end. Like
The collectors do, but
well, even them, like some of them, you know, like Johnson passed away at an early age. Like, no, it didn't have anything to do with the artifacts or anything like that, but none of these guys seem, or gals,
yeah, there are a few
seems
gals,
to
for sure.
be winning. Like this is a no-win game.
You win temporarily, I guess.
Yeah.
And then you pretend you think it'll last forever, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, it's the same as, like, you know, any, I guess, illicit industry, right? Cocaine dealing at this time. And this was the kind of the first time where his murder was like the first time where people, it seemed to have clicked, like, oh my gosh, this is just as dangerous as drug smuggling.
Right. And so we move back to the back flap stuff, and Robert Bazin, who we now know was an FBI agent all along. Like you said, his heart surgery story was faked because he had retired at this point. So he just needed an excuse, essentially, to pass it on to
Bob
someone who
and-
was still working.
Yeah.
And I guess he came up with the story on the spot, which is pretty impressive.
Right.
Yeah.
I would have been like, oh no, panic.
Yeah, panic. I got a thing. Yeah. And we find out that Bill Becker, who was kind of the con man who was acting as go-between Garcia and Bazin, had been actually an informant the whole time as well.
There is so much backstabbing and betrayal in this industry. It's like,
this is interesting. So when they stopped contacting Bazin assumed that Becker had betrayed him.
right.
Because it blows my mind this was even maybe a part of his thought process. You know, he is basically an informant so he can avoid jail time. He is not in a position of any leverage here.
Right.
And they did the deal where he bought the necklace from the smugglers. And he thought that Becker betrayed him because Becker wanted a share of the money.
Right.
Like, that's not what doing, and you're not in that position here, buddy.
Right. Yeah.
Turned out that wasn't it, but the fact that he thought it was shows you how likely it seemed to be, apparently.
Mhm.
I have here, the only thing he was entitled to was not going to jail.
Right.
The truth was actually, though, that someone Becker had informed on outed him as an FBI mole, and so the smugglers then cut ties with Bazin. However, Garcia didn't end on good terms with those smugglers, and so no one bothered to tell
Right.
him.
He didn't get the memo.
He didn't get the memo. And so when Garcia reopened negotiations a few years later, he was earnest about it. And so, yeah, kind of crazy.
Oh, and I guess at one point, one of the things that they had sold Bazin was what they thought was a fake Monet.
Oh, they tried to sell it,
Yeah, yeah,
but he
that's right.
didn't buy it.
Yeah, they tried to sell it, and eventually it came out on the market somewhere or something, and it was authenticated, and it was an
It's a
actual
real Monet.
Monet.
And now it sits in a private collection somewhere.
Yeah.
Which, honestly, as far as like problematic behavior in this book,
Yeah. And I think that's
Rocket,
more
yeah.
common and more accepted with like art than it is.
you don't have the problems of lost context with art.
Right. Yeah. Right.
They're
But I just was
destroyed.
like, oh my gosh, like there's so many little twists and,
Yeah.
you know, backstabbing and betrayal. This is great.
Yeah, it's
Great
really good.
read.
And so ultimately, though, Bazin was really unhappy that the deal didn't go through because he basically had to really put his career kind of on the line, essentially, to get the money to buy that necklace, to use U.S. taxpayer money to buy that. And then it fell through. And so it was kind of just a stain on his record before he retired. And so he
Right.
was like, yes, he was really excited to get to finish it.
Yeah.
So that is actually where we end on that cliffhanger, which just about killed me. I didn't read on, but I'll have to wait until I start reading it, just like you all will have to wait, or find the book yourself, I guess. You can have that option too.
Yeah, read it along with us.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
So this section, a lot more lively than the previous one, I feel.
Oh my gosh, this is like some kind of, it reminds me of like a soap opera or something.
Yeah.
If a soap opera was about tomb raiding.
Or like a less violent mobster type series, right?
It just, and some of it, I can't help but laugh. Like, not because it's funny, but just because, like, the reading the letter out loud in English and Spanish, and the Monet actually being real, and just, it's like, oh my goodness.
These things actually happen. It's not just on TV
yes,
sometimes.
And
yeah.
Oh, good. And the amount of betrayal just blows my mind.
Yep. You could learn a few things if you're a criminal from this book, actually.
Yeah.
Don't ever cut anyone out.
Yes. Yeah, I can't believe like Garcia just went along with it because, like I said, he never got the memo.
Right. Or like the betrayal because they were now bringing in gold stuff and didn't give him a cut of the increased profits or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, this is crazy.
Yeah. It was, I enjoyed this portion much more than I did the
Still
first
plenty
portion.
of unpleasant subjects, but there's glimmers of hope.
Yes.
And it is, again, it's just really well written.
It's really well written, and you start to see people understanding that this is an issue.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's
and
really
taking
important.
it on themselves to deal with it.
Yes. Even when it's kind of an uphill battle, like in Capo's case. With,
or Bazin's case, like he really had to fight to get the money. As he pointed out, like for drug deals, it was nothing compared to what they would put into drug deals.
Yeah. It made me wonder, like, how much taxpayer money is used in these kind of stings.
Because it wasn't like $250,000 for the necklace thing.
Yeah.
Like, holy cow.
And apparently, you know, and
must be putting a lot of money into this stuff.
I don't think I want to know.
I don't want to know. Don't tell us, please.
Yes.
All right. Well, that wraps us up for this one. We have finished section 1. The next episode, we will move on and we'll read all of part 2, I think.
Yeah, I think that's what we decided.
Yep. And then we'll finish up with part 2, and then part 3 will be the final episode for this book. So I can't wait to find out what happens next. And if you can't wait to find out what happens next, we'll see you next time.
Happy reading.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.